Howdy, men. Tonight we start with the splendid lives and brilliant resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, notwithstanding the chances, managed to survive some of the coldest and maximum brutal nights in records. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal dozing techniques, their tale is certainly one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to just like the video and subscribe, however simplest if you really enjoy what I do here. And let me realize within the feedback where you are tuning in from and what time it's miles for you. It's always charming to peer who's joining us from around the arena. Now dim the lighting, perhaps activate a fan for that gentle background hum, and allows ease into this night's journey together. When you consider medieval existence, you may think jousting nights, grand feasts, and merry galas. But for the common peasant, iciness became less approximately merriment and more about how do we not die tonight. It wasn't only a season. It turned into a take a look at of patience that got here round each oar, like an especially merciless instructor who did not agree with in second chances. Photograph this. You're residing in a tiny mud and stick hut with walls so thin you could likely pay attention a chicken sneeze from outside. No insulation, no home windows until you matter a small hollow filled with animal pores and skin, and in reality, no thermostat wars together with your siblings. The internal temperature of your private home was commonly only a polite couple of ranges above regardless of the weather changed into doing out of doors. If it was freezing outdoors, it was with politeness barely less freezing interior. Congratulations. Nights have been the worst. Darkness swallowed the whole lot. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fireplace in the fire sputtered pathetically, doing its first rate, however typically simply roasting the FT of whoever became sitting closest. If you had been on the opposite facet of the room, sorry, you can as nicely have been camping outside with worse snacks. Apparel wasn't lots assist both. Peasants failed to personal fancy, fur coats, or goose-down blankets. You had more than one hard-spun wool tunics, perhaps a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a desire that layering them could turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it did not genuinely paintings. And forget about snuggling beneath soft quilts. Beds have been often not anything more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, perhaps with some old rushes thrown in for good measure, and bonus, some fleas for extra organization. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The bloodless wasn't just uncomfortable, it changed into risky. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to loss of life had been consistent risks, especially for younger children and the elderly. Every morning which you awoke still respiratory became taken into consideration, a minor miracle and honestly well worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't approximately comfort. It became approximately gritting your tooth, piling on every piece of fabric you owned, huddling with your farm animals, and praying you failed to awaken with icicles striking off your eyebrows. And the actual adventure, it became just starting. In case you assume your apartment is drafty due to the fact the window doesn't near nicely, medieval peasants would like a phrase. Their houses were not just drafty. They were essentially very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Maximum peasant homes had been what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket smeared with a charming mixture of dust, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They were not trying to be gross. Dung turned into a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it turned into usually without difficulty available, shall we embrace. Those partitions, regardless of how lovingly smeared, failed to stand a great deal risk towards a proper winter typhoon. The cold wind observed every crack, every hole, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room houses, swirling round and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy, certainly now not. Warm temperature, no longer really. Person building, absolutely. And then there have been the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque. Positive, however, after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and sometimes let in the nearby natural world. Nothing says satisfactory evening like a squirrel losing onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, had been laughably tiny and normally covered with skinny animal hides or timber shutters. Glass was so pricey that even the lord of the manor likely could not come up with the money for more than an unmarried tiny pane, and peasants. They have been just glad if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-snowfall. To make subjects worse, floors had been regularly simply compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed closely, dust seeped up via the floor, so technically you may say they'd indoor water features. Now not that they liked it. In wintry weather, each step internal your own home may want to feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Bloodless from underneath, bloodless from above, cold from inside. It turned into a three-dimensional assault for your frame heat. However, medieval peasants were not the kind to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed antique rags into the worst drafts, and huddled near each other. Human insulation at its best. Creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls had been often the most effective element standing among them and becoming medieval popsicles. Due to the fact if your property turned into falling apart, and your best protection against the factors involved dust and goat hair, well, at the least you can laugh about it. Sort of if your tooth weren't chattering too tough. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also needed to struggle a silent enemy rising from under, the frozen floor itself. Floors weren't genuinely floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Perhaps if you had been fortunate, a person had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you have been drowsing one insulted lower back far from the cold, difficult dust. And oh, that bloodless was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones, and immediately into your very soul. In case you dropped something onto the floor during a wintry weather night time, congratulations. It was now a part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim conflict in some ways. One technique turned into layering thick mats of straw across the ground if you could have the funds for it, or extra realistically, if you can steal enough of it from your neighbor's place without getting stuck. You might have a decent, insulating barrier. However, straw flattened quick, got moldy even quicker, and introduced an additional crunchy soundtrack to your already depressing nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often, they would throw sparkling rushes on top without cleansing out the old ones. Over time, this created a charming environment of decomposing plants, fleas, and some thriller creatures decided to transport in. It became essentially medieval carpet padding, in case your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds for folks who had them did not solve much. They had been commonly little greater than wooden frames full of, you guessed it, extra straw or hay. In preference to comfortable mattresses, you had poking, moving, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from under. Tossing and turning wasn't about consolation. It turned into a determined, awkward dance to preserve blood flowing and avoid freezing one facet of your frame. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't triumph over the icy ground a lot as learn how to live uncomfortably above it. A good nighttime sleep wasn't about goals or softness. It was about waking up with all of your feet still attached. And if you may pull that off, what's up? You were doing better than maximum. If medieval houses had a single hero all through wintry weather, it wasn't the roof or the partitions, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, cussed hearth pit that served as the simplest real protection in opposition to the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval lifestyles. On the center of almost every peasant domestic turned into an easy fire. No fire with a flowery stone mantle, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. As an alternative, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you surprise if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most homes failed to actually have chimneys. Smoke just sort of did its first rate. It drifted out via small holes within the roof, cracks within the walls, or right into your lungs if it turned into feeling lazy that night. It wasn't best for breathing or your typical lifespan, but on the intense side, it did a notable process of fumigating fleas and different undesirable visitors. Who wishes pest manipulate when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The fire wasn't just about warmth either. It became the kitchen, the mild source, and occasionally even the medieval version of a television. Humans sat around the hearth telling tales, gossiping, or just staring into the flames due to the fact, frankly, there wasn't a great deal else to do after sunset. Keeping the fireplace alive wasn't simply a nice concept. It changed into obligatory. Letting the fireplace die out at night time turned into like putting up a sign for the cold to are available in and end you off. Plus, reigniting a hearth in wintry weather wasn't as easy as hanging a suit. You needed to work with flint, metal, kindling, and greater prayers than you would ever supplied before. Absolutely everyone inside the family had a responsibility. Stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat sticks, or if you have been fortunate, a treasured piece of dry wooden. It turned into a constant battle among human persistence and the smothering cold that desired nothing greater than to snuff you out. The fireplace did not guarantee survival, but without it, survival changed into downright impossible. It turned into a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter, it turned into the thrashing coronary heart of hope. If there has been one factor medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it turned into letting the hearth exit overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And inside the useless of winter, restarting a hearth from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it can be deadly. Matches didn't exist, but lighters. Dream on. Rekindling a fireplace supposed striking flint and metal together, praying for an unmarried precious spark, after which coddling that spark with soft love and something dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Consider looking to do all this within the freezing darkish, half of asleep with frozen arms. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for additional motivation. So peasants were given clever. They banked the fireplace. No, now not in a comfortable financial savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers underneath a mound of ash right before mattress. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and retaining them alive, just barely, until morning. In case you did it proper, you may walk over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add clean wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it incorrect, well, allows just say mornings were given an entire lot chillier and a whole lot more bad-tempered. Firebanking was an art surpassed down from discern to toddler, like a prized circle of relatives' recipe. Everybody had their own little secrets. A few stated use dry ash simplest. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. A few packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. You may practically start a medieval argument just via suggesting a better firebanking approach. It changed into the historic model of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. From time to time, banking the hearth wasn't sufficient. A howling wind might sneak via a crack and snuff it out besides. Or an inept sheep would possibly stumble into the fire. Yes, it came about. That is why a few families took turns getting up within the night to check the coals, basically the medieval equal of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the long run, firebanking changed into much less about mastering nature and greater about shopping for only a few more precious hours of heat. And in case you woke up to even an unmarried surviving ember, that was your victory right there, and sufficient to face another day of fighting the bloodless. In medieval instances, the phrase, "the extra the merrier," wasn't just about events. It became a wintry, whether survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire supply of heat, every different. And if that meant drowsing cheek to cheek along with your complete own family, friends, livestock, and in all likelihood a very careworn goose, so be it. Forget about approximately private area. Privacy wasn't even a concept. At the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It changed into "don't awaken frozen to the floor." Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the residence, wrapped in whatever scraps of material they could find, and shaped what ought to pleasant be described as a desperate, loud night breathing human lasagna. More younger children squeezed in among mother and father, grandparents snuggled underneath the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel confirmed up all at once, well, there was always room for one greater. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, wherein body warmth radiated from all sides. In case you were unfortunate, you had been on the edge, the medieval equivalent of slumbering next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much for the duration of the night time. You shift as soon as to get at ease, and all at once you have knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft via the wall. Congratulations, you are now the own family villain. Now and again, even bedding turned into shared, a communal straw bed that slowly flattened beneath the nightly weight of a couple of generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly prevailing any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant snoozing association. But hiya, when it's you as opposed to frostbite, you stop being choosy. Body warmth wasn't just first-rate, it became strategic. A few medieval guides even recommended intentionally arranging the most powerful, warmest humans on the outside of the group, like human shields towards the bloodless. Bobbies and frail elders were tucked deep in the middle, treated just like the treasured little warmth turbines they have been. This wasn't just about survival, even though. Over time, it became part of daily existence, part of family bonding. Long wintry weather nights huddled collectively caused storytelling, making a song, and absolutely a few very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just don't forget. As a minimum, you're not preventing for elbow space between a loud night-breathing uncle and an especially judgmental goat. If you thought cutting-edge roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, essentially anything with a pulse and a little bit of frame heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village lifestyle. It was important for survival. Farm animals generated warm temperature, and in a poorly insulated hovel wherein the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, in case your goat shared a wall with you, it became slightly much less likely to get stolen through a neighbor in the useless of night. Two birds, one pungent stone. At night time, the house became a chaotic reciting furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted close to the fireplace, and cows lounged luxuriously towards the walls, chewing cud like they paid lease. It wasn't glamorous, a long way from it. If you've ever been caught in an automobile on a summertime avenue trip with someone who forgot to shower, believe that. But it's a cow, it's wintry weather, and there is literally nowhere else to head. The smells. Legendary. By using springtime, the fragrance of a shared wintry weather became something fierce. You didn't need to mild a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't whine a good deal due to the fact they knew one uncomfortable reality: the extra animals inside, the less frozen feet within the morning. Certain animals even had top spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center level close to the own family. Goats had been allowed nearer in for their warm temperature, and due to the fact goats, being goats, would discover a way internal besides. Chickens roosted in rafters or antique baskets, and pigs, well, pigs failed to care. They plopped down anywhere they pleased, likely right in the center of the ground. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully only to be rudely awoke by way of a chook, finding out your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, regardless of the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the easy math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle whether or not they want to or not. Inside the struggle against wintry weather's icy arms, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath changed into regularly the figuring out issue among existence and dying. In medieval winters, style wasn't about searching correct. It changed into about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the modern-day traits. They were layering up like they were preparing for war against the grim Reaper himself. The rule turned into simple: in case you owned it, you wore it sometimes. First, the primary undertunic, a scratchy, possibly not too easy linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then every other, in case you had it, add some leggings that sagged on the knees, a hard cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you had been truly lucky, a patched-up sheep skin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations! You're now about 10% warmer and itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their FT in layers of fabric or antique rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold nonetheless bit via, well, you just delivered every other rag and hoped you did not lose a toe. And forget about washing a majority of these layers. Washing your garments in the middle of winter intended dragging them to a frozen flow, smashing via the ice, after which waiting 2 days in your best blouse to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic blouse cycle, most peasants accurately determined that smelling like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and sheep become a small rate to pay for no longer freezing solid. Curiously, the dust and grease buildup had an advantage function: insulation. That dirty layer locked in frame heat. It turned into like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and some distance less socially acceptable nowadays. Hats, scarves, and gloves have been prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could imply the difference between making it through the night time or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves had been regularly homemade from some thin scraps of leather or cloth human beings may want to scrge. Every now and then searching more like sad puppet costumes than anything stylish. Children had been in particular swaddled until they resembled overfilled turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The purpose became to lure as a great deal valuable body warmness as viable. Style beauty in no way heard of them. Warmth changed into the real medieval flex. So the subsequent time you bitch about layering up for a chilly day, just recall medieval peasants walked around wearing half of their dresser without delay, looking like lumpy laundry baggage and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dust wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It turned into almost a survival device. Because it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you would given up on existence. It was tactical, strategic, dare we are saying genius. See, wintry weather posed a very precise trouble: heat loss. Smooth clothes, particularly freshly laundered linen, had been extraordinarily horrible at retaining you heat. They had been breathable, sure. However, when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and on-the-spot remorse, breathable wasn't exactly a promoting factor. It is wherein dust got herein. As peasants trudged via every day without washing their clothing, layers of filth, natural frame oils, and good, old mud started out to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Through the years, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps inside the material, making garments greater wind-resistant. It became like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Certain you smelled like a goat who misplaced a guess, but guess what? You have been heat. In reality, a few medieval folks believed that washing yourself too frequently in winter may want to surely make you sick. Higher to maintain that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing become uncommon, laundry even rarer, and soap, whilst it existed, was reserved for serious occasions like when the bishop showed up or perhaps right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their garments without changing the ones under. You just threw your new layer on pinnacle of closing months. Ultimately, you became a taking walks museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain telling the heroic tale of that one time I slipped inside the dust but did not die. To out-of-doors observers, medieval peasants might have seemed and smelled like they'd absolutely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That dirty, crusty tunic became a thermal protect against demise by means of frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, however, neither become freezing to dying due to the fact you desired to odor like plants. Besides, in a world where literally all and sundry stank to high heaven, you were not offending each person. Nostril blindness was practically a way of existence. So yes, in medieval winters, grime wasn't failure. It became style. It became characteristic. And in case you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my buddy, were triumphing at existence. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, suppose again. The reality changed into a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plant life and wish for the fine. Beds inside the medieval peasant world were commonly a hardwood frame if you can manage to pay for one, covered with a big sack filled complete of straw, hay, or antique rushes. That is it. No reminiscence foam, no orthopedic support, no five-celebrity lodge experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and flip in the night time introduced a satisfying soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wood body altogether and just threw the straw immediately onto the dust floor, developing a luxurious ground-level sound asleep experience that modern-day influencers might probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses were not just uncomfortable. They have been temporary. Through the years, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally was a biological threat sector. Converting the straw was a big event, usually done some instances a 12 months if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively shifting without your permission. Rushes were a famous alternative. These lengthy grasses have been spread thick at the ground, every so often blended with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor, cattle aroma of daily existence. Sparkling rushes smelled adorable for approximately a day. After that, they became a part of the muddy, trampled panorama within the house, mixing seamlessly with dust, meal scraps, and something else wandered in. And let's no longer forget about the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and different captivating critters cherished straw bedding almost as much because the peasants did. In case you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were reciting the authentic medieval revel in. Notwithstanding the hardships, those humble beds had been lifesavers. Piles of straw furnished a critical insulating layer against the frozen earth. And clumping together, atop them created pockets of shared frame heat. Medieval principle heating at its greatest. So subsequent time you sink into your gentle, supportive bed, just keep in mind someplace obtainable a medieval peasant is asking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing enamel and pronouncing, should be satisfactory. When you stay in a residence made from sticks, mud, and optimism, you speedy analyze that wintry weather breezes are not just a nuisance. They're personal assaults. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outdoor. They fought it from internal their very own homes, armed with not anything, however, whatever they could cram into the cracks. And believe me, there have been a whole lot of cracks. Partitions warped, dust crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold appeared to locate new places to sneak in each night time, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the residence have become an art shape. Peasants filled gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it became easy, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it changed into jammed into a hollow somewhere. A few specifically decided souls daubed more layers of mud, and dung over the outside in their partitions as an annual wintry weather venture. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your very own house whilst muttering, "This is nice." That is luxury, due to the fact in a manner it was. Roof leaks were every other battlefield. Thatch, while reasonably priced and plentiful, wasn't exactly water-resistant, especially after some seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes within the roof with spare bits of fabric, bundles of reeds, or in moments of authentic desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the closest subject. Every domestic sooner or later began to appear like a barely sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, home windows. If you had them, you were lucky, but even then, they had been little extra than wooden planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes have been frequently covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fats to dam out the worst drafts and add an advantage aroma of mystery meat to the dwelling space. Every night time turned into a war between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky bloodless. One minute you had been heat, the subsequent minute an unexpected gust would discover the one spot you neglected, slapping you unsleeping like a frosty hand of doom. But by some means, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept, slightly frozen, as a permanent kingdom of being, medieval peasants patched, filled, and muddled their manner through the worst winters nature may want to throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. While the bloodless bite's difficult enough to keep you conscious at night time, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend every person's drowsing immediately. Rather, they evolved a survival method that these days would make any army commander proud, dozing in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized machine with whistles and roll calls. It changed into a ways simpler and plenty more determined. Half of the family stayed unsleeping, tending to the fireplace and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, seeking to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fireplace wished constant attention. Left alone, it'd die down, and restarting it, recall, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol. And seeing that no person desired to stand up after they had been in the end warmish, households turned around shifts. You dozed for some hours, got elbowed wide awake, then stumbled over to the fire to poke, prod, and curse the hearth back to lifestyles, while attempting now not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There weren't any nighttime imaginative and prescient goggles, no late nighttime snacks, and actually no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment closer to whoever snored loudest for the duration of your shift. Youngsters old enough to preserve a stick had been pressed into provider, learning early that in iciness everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents once in a while stayed by the fireplace longer, each due to their experience and admittedly due to the fact arthritis made mendacity down, and getting up once more an enormous event. And whilst it changed into your turn to sleep, good fortune with humans moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the partitions, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too difficult. Getting first-class rest turned into a miracle. Yet notwithstanding the exhaustion, the device labored. Dozing in shifts intended that there became constantly a hard and fast of eyes and cold, begrudging fingers ready to keep the fireplace alive. The embers survived, and by way of extension, so did the circle of relatives. So subsequent time you grumble about waking up to regulate the thermostat or let the cat out. Spare a notion for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fireplace at 3:00 am, questioning if feet had been certainly that critical. In any case, you know it's cold when you have to consider the way you breathe just to live alive. Medieval peasants didn't just war the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to continue to exist the night time. The problem turned into easy. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air immediately into your lungs. In a global wherein pneumonia could kill you faster than you can say Hail Mary, that turned into a hazard no person wanted to take. So, peasants learned the artwork of what you might call survival respiration. In place of sucking in big gulps of air like they had just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea changed into to softly heat the incoming air a chunk before it hit their lungs. It wasn't best, but it became better than coughing yourself into the grave by means of February. If you by accident took a massive mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just sold yourself a price tag to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul without a doctor's in sight and grandma treating you with warm onion tea and firm prayers. A few people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces even as they slept, developing a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this additionally supposed you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy material patch clinging to your mouth by way of mourning. But howdy, it beat freezing from the inside out. Youngsters had been taught those tricks early on. Parents could scold infants for panting like puppies indoors in the course of the cold months. And in reality, among strict respiration instructions, itchy wool layers, and snoozing subsequent to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, respiratory became an art form. Sluggish, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly feasible, like a few grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest approach, however it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants continued some other night time inside the lengthy, relentless struggle against winter. Within the limitless battle against medieval wintry weather, peasants found an unlikely secret weapon, a complete stomach. Seems one of the high-quality ways to combat off the bloodless wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It turned into stuffing yourself with something hardy and heavy proper before mattress. Power meant warm temperature. The more your body needed to digest, the greater it heated itself up doing the work. It is simple medieval thermodynamics. Consume a heavy meal, generate internal warmth, and perhaps, just perhaps, live to tell the tale until morning without becoming a peasant-formed popsicle. So, what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates earlier than an extended freezing night? Suppose thick stews, heavy with root veggies like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains have been lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense chewy rye bread. In case you were in particular lucky, say after a pageant day or a generous slaughter, you would possibly even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't consolation food within the Instagram sense. No sensitive presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It became one full-size, vaguely brown meal designed to take a seat on your gut like a pleasant brick, slowly burning through the night time and preserving you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about ingesting lots. It was about eating clever. Ingredients that took longer to digest supplied a gradual, constant trickle of warmth. Fatty meals were particularly praised, not only for the power they supplied, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard. Peak medieval wintry weather luxury. Mother and father made certain even the pickiest youngsters ate heartily. No person cared if little Thomas did not like turnips. You ate the turnips, otherwise you shivered through the night time thinking about how a lot you overlooked the turnips. Harsh but powerful parenting, medieval fashion. Of course, heavy nighttime eating got here with its personal hazards. You might be warmer, but you have been additionally risking a night of brilliant, bizarre dreams fueled via a stomach attempting desperately to technique an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it really worth it? Absolutely. Due to the fact in the long run, peasants were not aiming for a Michelin star meal. They have been aiming to live on. And if that intended going to mattress complete, bloated and respiratory lightly through your nostril next to a steaming cow, well, that became just any other night time in the ongoing quest to peer any other frosty sunrise. Long earlier than electric blankets and fancy heated bed pads, medieval peasants had to get innovative in the event that they wanted a little more warm temperature at bedtime. And that is how the common or garden hay box and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rustic, and it definitely changed into, but the idea changed into pure genius. Peasants might take a strong timber box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store meals that were cooked in advance, preserving it heat for hours. Leftover stew, warm porridge, toss it into the hay container, cover it up, and it stayed warm enough for a past-due nighttime snack with no need to risk reigniting the fireplace. Medieval sluggish cookers, essentially. But peasants failed to just prevent at meals. They found out if hay should entice the warmth from a stew pot, it can additionally entice the warmth from something even better: rocks. Enter the technology of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, likely whichever unfortunate infant misplaced the circle of relatives' argument, could take hold of a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the fireplace. After roasting it until it became almost too hot to the touch, a quality line between beneficial and degree burn, that they had fished out the usage of a stick or a few vintage tongs. The stone, nonetheless radiating joyful warm temperature, might be cautiously wrapped in rags, tucked into an vintage piece of fabric, or jammed right into a clay pot, then slipped beneath the hay inside the bed or down on the foot of the mattress. A medieval heating pad geared up to do war towards the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. In case you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small localized house hearth. And in case you dropped it in your foot nicely, let's just say wintry weather accidents were not usually because of slipping on ice. But whilst the whole lot went right, that stone supplied valuable, comforting, warm temperature that would last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but while you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury became defined as now not waking up with icicles dangling out of your nose. Within the grand arsenal of medieval wintry weather survival, a hot rock tucked into a few hay may not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to something heat they may discover, it changed into a tiny miracle. In a medieval peasant's domestic, the fire wasn't simply in which you prepare dinner. It became almost a family member. A temperamental, smoky, once-in-a-while uncooperative family member. Sure, however, nevertheless absolutely critical to survival, in particular when it got here time to sleep. The closer you were to the fireplace, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That supposed snoozing arrangement had been less about non-public choice and extra about strategic positioning. Bobbies the elderly, and each person ill or frail, got first dibs on high real property. Mother and father, older children and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the hearth wasn't just kindness. It became simple survival math. Bobbies were fragile heat generators, and elders have been precious repositories of own family expertise, and let's be honest, the first-class gossip. Shielding them with high warm temperature was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all secure toasting by the flames. Too close, and also you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and also you had been essentially tenting in an ice box. It changed into a delicate dance. Live close to enough to bask inside the hearth's glow, but no longer so close to which you needed to provide an explanation for to your neighbor why you currently appeared like a 1-2 cooked roast. The fire also did not spread warm temperature lightly. It, number one, roasted the human beings at once in front of it, whilst absolutely everyone else fought over the slender cone of heat like bloodless lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you have been fortunate enough to doze off facing the fire, you may have one blissfully heat aspect, and one side frozen so stable you could probably knock on it. Pets and farm animals, of course, muscled in too. A canine would possibly wedge itself among you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously near open flame. Chickens now and again perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of heat. Each crackle of the logs, each shift of sparkling embers became a tiny promise. You are nonetheless alive, you're still heat for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled through the fireplace's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fireplace's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't relaxed, however it became existence, clinging to warmth by a thread of sparkling coals. Within the medieval international, no person survived winter on my own, except they desired to emerge as a totally elegant frozen statue by means of January. Survival wasn't only a circle of relatives affair. It turned into a village venture. A messy, muddy, loud collaboration in which everybody's warmth and existence relied on absolutely everyone else. The peasants knew that within the lifeless of wintry weather, a sturdy fire and a pile of hay may want to simplest accomplish that much. If your neighbor's residence went darkish, you observed. If the smoke from Antique Tom's fire stopped curling into the sky, a person went to test. And not just due to the fact Tom owed you a chicken, although that is probably part of it, but due to the fact community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, regularly the young or the aged, who could not work the fields, but could keep a watch on who become coughing too difficult, who hadn't come to barter at the marketplace in some days, or whose home looked a little too still within the morning frost. Those humans had been the medieval version of community patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus plenty greater sheep. If a circle of relatives' fireplace went out, it changed into a near emergency. A good neighbor might rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or higher yet, invite them into their personal smoky, overcrowded hut for the night time. Yes, it supposed squeezing a further 4 bodies into an already cramped area, but it turned into better than locating frozen friends come spring. Communal meal stores performed a function, too. For the duration of in particular brutal winters, villages on occasion pulled their last salted meat, grain, and dried veggies. It was grim charity. No one had a good deal, but a few communal food can be the distinction between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver timber, shared embers, and ran pressing messages when a person wished assist. No one became too small or too worn out when iciness got here knocking. Certain medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds occurred. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot by no means certainly went away. However, when the nights grew lethal cold, vintage grudges were frequently quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still really worth saving, because the next day it'd be you needing rescue. Inside the icy coronary heart of wintry weather, the village have become one huge, stubborn circle of relatives. Sometimes dysfunctional, regularly hilarious, constantly fiercely determined to live to tell the tale together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants confronted the merciless bloodless of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fireplace. They prayed plenty. Due to the fact whilst the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fireplace shrank into sullen embers, you wanted each viable advantage, which includes a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It became woven into each frozen breath. Earlier than crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel collectively, providing up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their feet attached by mourning. Saints have become greater than remote holy figures. They were wintry weather's frontline defense. Zenta. Blaze, for example, turned into referred to as a pond to shield in opposition to throat ailments, not a minor challenge when one mouthful of icy air ought to land you coughing up your soul. Zenta. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He changed into also requested to shield families from unexpected spoil throughout the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly round daily survival. A few families sprinkled a contact holy water close to the fire before sound asleep, hoping it would protect towards evil spirits or at least mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after positive feast days, pleading for heat and good fortune to find their manor inside. Candles performed a position too. Special vigil candles, regularly blessed by way of the nearby priest or the maximum pious antique lady within the village, had been every now and then saved burning throughout the night, a flickering plea towards the bloodless darkness clawing at the partitions. And of root, no critical iciness prayer consultation turned into complete without some promises. Expensive Lord, in case you just get us via this night time, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who maintains stealing our turnips. Religion wasn't some summary consolation. It was a everyday pressing communique. The peasants were not soliciting for luxury, simply survival. A bit warmness, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It turned into simple raw hope whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked beneath itchy blankets that someway carried them via the infinite, cruel nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter received, it did not just take a few unfortunate souls. It took entire families, entire villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. A few winters have been in particular cruel, like the infamous terrific famine winter of 1315, when rains destroyed vegetation, cattle starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal life right into a gradual, grinding disaster. Human beings had been so desperate that memories whispered of ingesting shoe leather, bark, and inside the most horrifying instances, each other. Failure to maintain the hearth alive wasn't simply an inconvenience. It became regularly a loss of life sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, households huddled together for the very last time. Friends might occasionally stumble across entire families in spring, their bodies still locked in each other's frozen embody, as if trying to proportion only a little greater warmth until the very give up. Houses themselves could crumble beneath the burden of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving manor inside the middle of a frozen night time wasn't just catastrophic. It changed into often deadly. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg safe haven from friends wasn't a guarantee both, especially if the one's associates had been already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold, too. Starvation weakened the frame, and cramped, smoky homes become breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and different deadly infections. A simple cough in December may want to effortlessly be a funeral by means of January. After which there was the quiet horror, frostbite. Hands, feet, even ears blackened and died at the same time as nonetheless attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the fee of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it via, however winter took a bit of me." Yet, what's maximum haunting isn't always just the dying, it is the eerie normality of it. Human beings every day that every iciness, a few among them wouldn't see the spring. Death wasn't unexpected. It turned into just every other neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its flip. Even amid the bitter cold and regular risk, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life, because so long as there was one ember left inside the fire, one breath putting inside the frozen air, there was nonetheless a fight worth preventing. When we look again at medieval peasants, the ones muddy, frost-bitten survivors of infinite winters, it's tempting to peer past their hardships, the cracked fingers, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried under all that war is something some distance greater powerful, a legacy of uncooked, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They did not have critical heating, thermal jackets, or comfortable reminiscence foam mattresses. They didn't actually have the luxurious of assuming they'd live to tell the tale till spring. However, what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Each haystead bed, every hand-banked fireplace, every moss-crammed wall gap become a testament to human creativity beneath pressure. Confronted with impossible odds, they failed to crumble in despair. They tailored. They discovered from the land, from each other, and from the sour training carved by using every brutal winter. Their communities had been built on more than shared land. They were constructed on shared survival. They taught every other to look at over the unwell, to tug resources when food ran low, To accept as true with that supporting a freezing neighbor today, supposed a person may assist you the next day. They lived via the expertise that nobody beats wintry weather on my own. Their religion, too, become a sort of endurance. They wove prayers into their everyday lives, no longer just out of worry, but out of desire. Fragile, stubborn wish that the next day might be a little warmer, a bit brighter. Wish that when 100 dark nights, spring could come once more, and existence would find a way to push via the frozen ground. And one way or the other it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one extra night, one extra hurricane, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely live to tell the tale, until warmness and luxury have become common expectations as an alternative than distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every relaxed blanket, each warm house, each lazy winter night spent sipping tea beneath gentle lights. All of it is miles the quit end result of limitless medieval peasants refusing to present into the bloodless. So the following time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The anonymous, fearless ones who flip shivering survival right into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one cussed heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn failed to come into the sector with a crown on her head or armies at her ft. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she became the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an bold diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble lady with powerful own family ties. Within the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's start barely stirred a ripple, yet from those modest beginnings, something extraordinary changed into taking root. A existence that might sooner or later tilt the course of English history. From an early age, Anne became set apart not through her wealth, but by using her mind. She was smart, lively, and by all accounts magnetic. Spotting her potential, her circle of relatives sent her overseas to the continent, where her training absolutely started out. First, she served Margaret of Austria inside the glittering court docket of the Netherlands, and revel in few English women may want to dream of. There, Anne absorbed the artwork of diplomacy, subtle manners, and the subtle dance of écu politics. But it changed into in France that Anne's brilliance became virtually polished. She spent years within the state-of-the-art courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, gaining knowledge of the language of have an effect on elegance, flirtation, and wit. At the same time as other young women perfected their embroidery, Anne mastered communication, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to are seeking it. By the time she lowered back to England in the early 1520s, Anne changed into something unusual. A lady who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers whilst carrying the ambition of a growing English residence. She wasn't a conventional splendor. Even her admirers admitted as much, but she became arresting. Dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a short, musical voice, a way of transferring that suggested purpose just slightly hid under layers of courtly grace. Anne didn't just enter rooms, she changed their gravity. At a time whilst a lady's destiny changed into regularly sealed through start and marriage, Anne refused to flow quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power that allure and intellect should wield in foreign courts, and she meant to use that know-how at home. Anne Boleyn became still a young woman then, smart, ambitious, untested, but history changed into already starting to stir around her. The girl who back to England turned into no longer simply Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She turned into a player in a larger game, one that might quickly engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn lowered back to the English courtroom, she changed into unlike everybody the nobility had ever seen. In a global full of pale confronted, modest English roses, Anne became a thunderstorm, electric-powered, unpredictable, not possible to ignore. Her darkish hair, ambitious eyes, and short, sharp wit set her other than the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. Before everything, she performed the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too brilliant to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the convenience of a native, and laughed with a self-assurance few ladies dared display. Guys observed. Women gossiped. The court buzzed quietly approximately the placing Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most risky attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII turned into no stranger to flirtation. His court became a playground of whispered promises and secret liaison, but Anne became distinctive. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like such a lot of others had. She teased. She challenged. She refused. Henry, a person used to on-the-spot adoration, became captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's period, the deeper he fell. Letters handed among them, packed with declarations of affection, frustration, and longing. Henry presented her the function of royal mistress, the maximum powerful unofficial position at court. Anne astonishingly said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he could have to make her his wife. It turned into a gamble so audacious that it shocked the court docket. In spite of everything, the king changed into already married. His queen, Catherine, became liked by using the people and fiercely blanketed through her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself must be defied for Henry to assert Anne. But Anne failed to recoil. She had lived inside the courts of Europe, where queens wielded soft energy from at the back of lace fanatics and painted smiles. She knew ambition turned into a risky game, but it turned into a recreation she meant to win. Standing inside the candle-lit halls of the English court docket, Anne Boleyn made her choice, not to be just admired, but to change her destiny and England's for all time. What started as an excessive flirtation among King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled right into a national disaster. Henry wasn't just besotted, he became obsessed. And in his obsession, he changed into willing to rip apart the whole lot England had acknowledged for hundreds of years. The king's choice to marry Anne hit a small snag. Namely, he became already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step apart. She had been Henry's trustworthy spouse for too many years, and inside the eyes of God and the English humans, she turned into the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it turned into nearly unthinkable. But Henry changed into determined. He satisfied himself and tried to persuade everybody else that his marriage to Catherine become cursed due to the fact she had once been married to his brother Arthur. Never thoughts that the Pope had granted special permission for his or her union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul became damned until he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her component, knew better than to seem too keen. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every look, every phrase was measured. She wasn't just aiming for marriage. She became positioning herself to emerge as Queen of England. The court docket erupted into whispers and factions. A few noble households eagerly courted Anne's prefer, seeing the winds of power moving. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote determined letters again to Rome. Overseas monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's very own advisors shifted uneasily, sensing the floor trembling underneath their toes. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his lawyers into locating loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the Church might now not bend without difficulty. Catherine had effective allies, inclusive of her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most effective guy in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying advice, subculture, and more the regulation itself. His courtship with Anne had emerged as something some distance, extra than personal choice. It became now a task to the very structure of England's political and spiritual lifestyles. Anne wasn't simply capturing a king's heart. She changed into dragging a whole state into uncharted waters. A dangerous recreation had all started, and there will be no turning lower back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering, scandal, and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII, a formidable circulate given that he became nonetheless technically married to Catherine of Aragon, inside the eyes of the Pope and lots of Europe. By way of June, Anne turned into crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her lifestyles. However, the environment changed into some distance from universally completely happy. The human beings of London watched with weary eyes. A few cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many questioned if this new queen, along with her French manners and ambitious spirit, turned into a blessing or a curse. Anne entered her queenship not as a liked figure, but as a storm. In contrast to Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne turned into remarkable, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore ambitious colorations, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking velocity. Her position, at the same time as seemingly comfy, became additionally terrifyingly precarious. The whole lot rested on one factor, imparting Henry with a male inheritor. Anne knew this as keenly as everyone. She became not just Henry's lover anymore. She became the desire of a dynasty. Early in her being pregnant, Anne and Henry were elated, sure the child might be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave delivery to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing unhappiness with grace, insisting the next child would absolutely be a son. Henry, however, became less composed. His eyes, as soon as full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court docket in her photo, elevating her own family to exceptional heights and turning into the first queen in English history crowned with the sacred oil commonly reserved for kings. Her had an effect on turned into sizable. Foreign ambassadors sought her prefer. Couriers reshuffled alliances to be in her properly graces. The as soon as obedient Henry began transferring England officially far from Rome, developing the Church of England with himself at its head, all in order that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even in her triumph, darkish clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their fingers. Rivals circled, waiting, and Henry, fickle and stressed, became already starting to appearance past the great girl who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but preserving it might call for more than allure, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed better than nearly any lady of her time, but the higher you upward push, the tougher the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her international started to reveal. On the coronary heart of Anne's struggles turned into the strain to supply a male inheritor. Her first baby, Elizabeth, though vibrant and wholesome, changed into now not the son Henry VIII had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock turned into ticking. Anne suffered more than one pregnancies in brief succession, but heartbreak followed, miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each misplaced child chipped away at the muse she had built. Henry, as soon as passionately dedicated, started to shy away, his disappointment carving rifts between them. Anne, never one to go through in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a person who prized obedience as an awful lot as splendor, grew uninterested in her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in. Outside the royal chambers, enemies had been collecting like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they noticed as robbery and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered in opposition to her, calling her the terrific, and blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed changes that observed. After which came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, the entirety Anne turned into no longer. Jane captured Henry's wandering attention just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and venture, Jane provided soothing compliance. It changed into a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it going on. She attempted to reclaim her function, lavishing attention on Henry, promising extra sons, begging for persistence. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining lifestyles without the girl for whom he had once torn a country aside. Anne's political enemies, inclusive of Thomas Cromwell as soon as her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the foundation for a marketing campaign of destruction, quietly amassing accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The girl who had performed the dangerous sport of ambition so masterfully became now dropping floor. Anne had received her crown through foxy and braveness, but in the brutal moving international of Henry's court docket, beyond victories supposed little. Only clean achievement mattered, and Anne's enemies were sprucing their knives. The queen who had shattered a country might soon see how speedy a nation could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's enemies did not attack her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets and techniques, and carefully sharpened lies. Inside the returned rooms of court docket, betrayal turned into brewing, silent, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, as soon as Anne's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had become against her. Their alliance were built on mutual ambition, however now their interests clashed. Anne desired reforms to assist the terrible and limit the electricity of greedy nobles. Cromwell desired stability, favor with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her risky. And in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into inflammation, suspicion, and bloodless detachment. Anne had few true friends left. Even her attraction, as soon as her best weapon, now grated against the courtroom's hunger for a gentler, greater pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight, the perfect comparison to Anne's fatting fire. It changed into Cromwell, who moved first, knowing Henry became restless, understanding that the king desired an exit, however lacked a convenient excuse. Cromwell supplied a solution. What if Anne could be eliminated, now not by divorce, which might humiliate Henry, but with the aid of shame? The accusations were wild, immense, even. Adultery, incest, conspiracy towards the king. Anne, the proud, amazing queen, painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown she as soon as redefined. Cromwell carefully amassed proof, coaxing confessions underneath torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, which include Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The expenses made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, truth became whatever the king wished it to be. Anne, sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's reminiscence, to the love that they had once shared, but it turned into no need. The person who had once torn England apart for her now refused to satisfy her eyes. In May additionally 1536, Anne was arrested and brought to the Tower of London. Because the terrific gate slammed shut in the back of her, she knew the fact. She turned into now not a queen. She turned into a prisoner, a pawn trapped inside the brutal recreation she had once performed so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her destiny. And now on my own inside the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the very last move. Anne Boleyn stood within the first-rate hall of the Tower of London, going through a tribunal of nobles, lots of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, organized to erase the girl who had once changed the future of England. The costs towards her had been stunning. Adultery with a couple of guys, together with her very own brother George Boleyn, high treason, conspiracy against the king. In every other world, such accusations in opposition to a queen would have been unthinkable. However, here, now, they have been simply theater, a grim performance designed to present Henry VIII exactly what he desired. Anne's downfall wrapped in a skinny veil of legality. Anne defended herself with the identical fire that had as soon as won Henry's heart. She denied each accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she were crowned with sacred oil, selected by using God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. However, it became occupied with nothing. The decision had been determined long before Anne set foot inside the court. The trial was a spectacle for the court docket and for the human beings, a public unmaking of her as soon as unbreakable lady. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning phrases. Dates and locations contradicted each other. Evidence became flimsy when it existed at all. But the reality became beside the point now. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the opposite guys accused together with her had been sentenced to dying as nicely. Anne could be executed through beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of putting, drawing, and quartering. When the decision changed into study, she did now not break. She stood tall, her face faded, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those very last moments before being led back to her mobile, she spoke clearly, announcing that she became prepared to die and prayed that God could have mercy on her soul. Because the heavy doorways of the corridor closed in the back of her, the court exhaled in relief. The Hurricane and were exquisite, dangerous, unforgettable became almost over, but even then they did not realize. They were now not erasing Anne Boleyn. They have been immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn turned into again to the Tower of London, now not because the triumphant queen who had as soon as commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner looking forward to loss of life. Yet even going through the cease, Anne refused to disintegrate. Within the bloodless, echoing halls of the Tower, Anne organized herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the difficult stone floors, her fingers clasped tightly, her voice regular. She confessed to no crimes, due to the fact she believed she had committed none. She became no longer afraid to die, she stated, but she prayed that her demise could convey peace to the Dominion and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her women in waiting, the ones few who had stayed unswerving, wept in personal. Anne comforted them, as opposed to the opposite manner round. She joked bitterly at instances that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor turned into the cussed spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VII, meanwhile, confirmed no sign of mercy. He had already grew to become his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date became finalized, Henry changed into arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this very last betrayal from the person who had as soon as torn down a nation for her, have to had been the innermost cut. On May additionally 18th, 1536, Anne became advised she could die the next morning. She slept little that night time. As an alternative, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and possibly for herself, for the ambition and delight that had led her right here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to perform the execution, faster, purifier, less brutal than an axe. It became a small mercy sold perhaps more for the king's sense of right and wrong than for Anne's consolation. At sunrise, Anne dressed cautiously for her very last second. A dark gray gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle under, colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it below a easy cap, equipped to face the blade with grace. Because the Tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mom, survivor, fighter, progressed. There might be no tears, no pleas, best a very last act of braveness within the face of history's judgment. Her end was near, however her story was just beginning. On the morning of May, additionally 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built in the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, some witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as though even the stone partitions held their breath. Anne stood tall, her gray robe fluttering barely within the bloodless morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at courtroom, her face faded but calm. There have been no hysterics, no broken sobs. If something, she faced death with the equal fierce dignity that had as soon as shaken a nation to its knees. She spoke briefly, cautiously choosing her final phrases. She did no longer accuse. She did now not shield herself. She prayed for the king's fitness and prosperity, the very guy who had deserted her. In the one's very last moments, Anne offered the scepter not a confession, but forgiveness. Her braveness bowled over even individuals who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to make certain a quick loss of life, progressed. Anne knelt upright, her palms folded in prayer, Her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white fabric became tied around her eyes. She remained nonetheless. The sword flashed as soon as, silent, quick, and Anne Boleyn, Queen, Mom, records maker, became no greater. She became buried speedy in an unmarked grave in the Tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow chest, due to the fact no right coffin have been organized for her. A queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's tale did not end in that cold grave. Her daughter Elizabeth, the kid whose delivery had as soon as disappointed a king, would upward rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen whose reign could see the flowering of English art, strength, and international affect. A queen who inherited her mom's fierce spirit, sharp thoughts, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the route of England for all time. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the delivery of the Church of England. Her fall confirmed the sector that even queens might be solid apart. But through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in lifestyles. In the long run, Anne Boleyn won a form of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible effect on records. By the early 1770s, the Yankee colonies simmered like a pot left too lengthy over a roaring fireplace. The relationship with Britain, as soon as seen because the proud mother country, had soured into resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. It hadn't began with tea. Years in advance, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by using setting taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That changed into followed with the aid of the Townshend Acts, taxing necessities like paper, glass, and paint. Every new law exceeded lots of miles away, by means of a parliament in which the colonists had no illustration turned into like another spark landing in dry brush. At the start, the anger showed itself in well-mannered petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson crammed newspapers with passionate arguments approximately liberty and rights. However, as time wore on, frustration deepened into something darker, a sluggish consciousness that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain failed to care. Many colonists clung to the desire that if they simply made enough noise, if they just reasoned difficult enough, Parliament might repeal the taxes, and on occasion they did. The Stamp Act changed into famously repealed after loud colonial protest. But every small victory turned into followed via new regulation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It in no way, without a doubt, turned into. The taxes themselves were modest by means of British requirements. What infuriated the colonists changed into the precept. They have been being taxed without consent, treated as subjects in place of citizens, ruled like remote possessions in place of companions. Boston, extra than another metropolis, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery institution of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence whilst British infantrymen fired on unarmed civilians in what have become known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Consider was an element of the past. By using 1773, the colonies have been teetering on the threshold. A very last insult would tip them into open defiance, and it came now not within the shape of infantrymen or new legal guidelines or armies, but within the quiet, reputedly harmless form of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't understand it yet, but the night that tea floated within the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the arena would alternate all the time. In 1773, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the Yank colonies might quietly receive inexpensive tea, they handed the Tea Act, a regulation that became supposed to save the struggling British East India Company, and by the way reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it gave the look of a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the organization to sell tea directly to the colonies, reducing out the middlemen, slashing prices, and providing a luxury product at a good buy, some pennies inexpensive. What ought to possibly cross wrong? Everything. Due to the fact the trouble wasn't the rate of tea, it changed into the precept in the back of it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in area. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's proper to tax the colonies without their consent. To many individuals, that became unthinkable, a surrender of the liberties they had fought to shield for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Traders fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that might crush nearby change. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown nevertheless believed it may do something it thrilled. In Boston, the reaction turned into mainly fierce. Already a city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of monetary trouble, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it became, a lure disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea have become a remember of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the purpose of liberty. Public conferences swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by using Samuel Adams and others, prepared boycotts, vowing that no East India Organization tea might be unloaded, sold, or inebriated on American soil. All throughout the colonies, ships wearing the controversial tea had been grew to become a way via local resistance. In ports from NY to Charleston, the message became clear: we will no longer be sold. However, in Boston, destiny twisted otherwise. 3 ships, the Dartmouth Asterisk, the Leaner Asterisk, and the Asterisk Beaver, arrived, anchored within the harbor, and sat there, refusing to go away. Royal officers insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. An impasse grew, taut as a drawn bowstring. The anxiety became insufferable. An unmarried act would break it, and records would by no means be the equal once more. Because the British tea deliverer sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor, the metropolis itself transformed right into a powder keg. Every day that surpassed without resolution tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting. It changed into preparing for a fight. In taverns, church buildings, and public squares, indignant colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved rapidly to prepare resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea, and held raucous conferences that swelled with farmers, artisans, and traders alike. Every gathering delivered fuel to the fireplace. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the resistance. Heaps stuffed into the wooden corridor, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Right here, resolutions had been exceeded, speeches had been made, and tempers boiled. Every vote towards the unloading of tea became another hammer blow against British authority. But while the human beings of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. British regulation demanded that imported goods like tea be unloaded, and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officers might seize the shipment, and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that after the tax became paid, even underneath protest, the principle would be misplaced. It wasn't pretty much the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would receive being treated as subjects without rights, or whether or not they might stand and fight for their future. In the meantime, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to allow the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, worrying that the regulation be obeyed, colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down supposed admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff have become a spectacle. Every man, lady, and child knew that something become coming. You may feel it in the air, that bloodless, sharp sense earlier than a typhoon, whilst the sector holds its breath. All it would take turned into one spark to ignite an explosion. And somewhere among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly taking form, a plan that might echo across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773, dawned gray and bloodless over Boston, a city balanced on the threshold of records. For almost 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat within the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the very last closing date had arrived. In line with British law, the tea had to be unloaded, and the tax paid within 20 days of a deliverer's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials should seize the cargo and British troops might be called in to put in force the regulation. Every person knew it. Everyone knew what turned into at stake. If the tea got here ashore, the precept was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty could unravel. That morning, heaps of Bostonians and close-by colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the biggest building in town. A few had walked miles through the icy geographical region to be there. The assembly changed into so packed that men spilled out into the streets, straining to listen the fiery speeches echoing via the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebel, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out towards tyranny, to urge instantaneous action. However, even some of the defiance, uncertainty hung heavy. What will be performed without sparking outright conflict? How could they prevent the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? Because the afternoon wore on, writers galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would no longer be allowed to depart without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax accumulated, the king's regulation enforced. The gang buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting residence appeared to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood flippantly and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This assembly can do nothing greater to keep the country. A simple sentence, but all people knew what it intended. There would be no greater petitions, no extra compromises. Movement might be taken. Outside, a warfare whoop cut via the collection gloom, the sign. Men disguised themselves speedy, smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling everyone. It changed into about growing a symbol, a message no person could mistake. The deadline had handed. Boston might answer, not with phrases but with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets commenced to stir. Figures moved via the shadows, everyday guys cloaked in difficult blankets, their faces blackened with soot, a few decorated with feathers. They were not looking to idiot all and sundry into believing they had been actual Mohawks. Their cover was symbolic, an act of losing their old identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By means of the handfuls, they made their manner to Griffin's Wharf, wherein the 3T ships, the Dartmouth Asterisk, the Leaner Asterisk, and the Asterisk Beaver Asterisk, lay anchored. The harbor water churned cold and dark underneath them, thick with the sharp chunk of wintry weather air. There has been no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was no longer a riot. It turned into a project done with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and golf equipment, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few group members nonetheless aboard. No damage got here to the sailors. They had been dismissed, watched in silence because the operation started out. Men split open the timber chests with practiced blows, the fragrant scent of clean tea spilling into the bloodless night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the nonetheless waters of the harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in overall, became damaged and dumped till the black water swirled with lots of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent, awed. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intrude. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains uncertain. Some bills recommend that even among British loyalists there was an expertise. Something had shifted, and there could be no preventing it this night. The field changed into brilliant. No shipment was stolen. No person raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated image of British oppression, turned into centered. In a metropolis in which hunger and complication were day-by-day realities, the guys could have effortlessly become the protest into an excuse for looting. They did now not. Whilst it turned into over, the harbor resembled a splendid swirling cauldron packed with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The odor of the ocean blended with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the nighttime air with a strange, bittersweet scent. The work turned into achieved. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left at the back of no names, no leaders, no claims to repute, best the unmistakable mark of revolution. Because the final damaged crates bobbed within the dark water, Boston stood still, almost preserving its breath. The Boston Tea birthday party wasn't a rise-up, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It turned into something some distance rarer, an act of bloodless, deliberate defiance executed under the cloak of night. The harbor converted into a large swirling teapot. Heaps of kilos of East India Organization tea floated in excellent mats at the water, staining it black. A few colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Not anything become to be salvaged. No person could benefit from this night's work. This changed into principle, pure and easy. The city woke the following morning to the odor of salty tea, striking heavy inside the air. News unfolded like wildfire, word of mouth, letters, large sheets. By noon, all people from apprentices to merchants knew what it came about. And critiques cut up rapid. Amongst patriots there was delight, a fierce, swelling pride that regular guys had stood as much as the mightiest empire within the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property turned into reckless, risky. Had the colonies crossed a line, they could not stroll lower back from. Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, livid now not most effective at the destruction, but at the message it sent. If the king's authority might be defied so overtly in Boston, in which else would possibly insurrection spark? British officers have been shocked. That they had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another rebellion like those that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected prepared, disciplined revolutionaries to evenly smash tens of lots of kilos of royal property, without a lot as breaking a window. The Deliver's captains, the Dartmouth Asterisk, the Leaner Asterisk, the Asterisk Beaver, ought to simplest watch helplessly as their shipment disappeared beneath the waves. In the reputable ledgers, the night's loss might be tallied at over 10,000 pounds British kilos, a fortune. However, the real loss wasn't measured in kilos sterling or ruined tea. It became measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile phantasm that Britain nevertheless dominated her colonies with consent. The nighttime the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface, a shared undeniable reality. The age of non-violent protest became finishing. A reckoning became coming, and Boston turned into prepared. While frays of the Boston Tea birthday party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction became rapid and furious. To British officials, it changed into now not virtually a protest. It turned into rebellion, an open, mocking project to royal authority that couldn't be overlooked. King George III, upon hearing the news, becomes stated to have grown bloodless with anger. Parliament, already annoyed by years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment, now not only for the metropolis of Boston, however, as a warning to all the American colonies. The result turned into a chain of laws so harsh they were fast, nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came unexpectedly, the Boston Port Act. In a single brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbor, the economic lifeline of the town, till the destroyed tea became paid for and order restored. Ships should not enter or go away. Trade vanished. Goods and materials dried up. Boston, as soon as vibrant and noisy, grew quiet, its docks eerily nonetheless. But the punishment failed to stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-governing rights, putting it firmly underneath the king's appointed officers. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officers accused of crimes to be tried, returned in Britain, a clean message that British government have been untouchable. And to make certain, the colony's new pressure turned into an alternative. British soldiers have been quartered throughout Boston, dwelling some of the very residents they were supposed to subdue. The message was clear: insurrection would be crushed. Liberty was a luxurious the Crown would no longer tolerate. However, Parliament's heavy hand had an accidental effect. As an alternative than frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. Information of Boston's struggling, of its port closed, its humans ravening below martial law, stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger at some stage in America. Wagon masses of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of guide, pledges of team spirit, and secret meetings commenced to weave the once fragmented colonies closer collectively. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was hastily becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain was hopping to make an instance of them. Alternatively, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, as soon as flickering in remoted pockets, now began to blaze from colony to colony, and there would be no easy extinguishing them. The punishment of Boston dispatched surprise, waves far beyond the rocky shorelines of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage became something some distance extra dangerous for Britain: solidarity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, bickering and competing, separated by way of geography, religion, and alternate rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, people throughout the continent realized if it is able to take place to Boston, it could take place to anybody. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response became quick. Colonists sent wagons full of food, supplies, and letters of unity to the struggling humans of Boston. Metropolis conferences buzzed with anger. Newspaper printers labored day and night time to unfold the news. The combat changed into not Boston's on my own. It was absolutely everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something unparalleled took place. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the primary time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies collected beneath one roof to talk about a unified reaction. Guys like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once merely regional figures, now stood together as architects of a movement that became growing larger by the day. Their aim, at least formally, was not yet complete independence. Maximum still was hopping for reconciliation, for a return to the old dating of mutual appreciate beneath the British crown, but below the polite debates and punctiliously worded petitions, a deeper know-how was taking root. The colonies should now not find the money for to stand one at a time. At the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British items. They pledged mutual aid inside the face of, in addition, British aggression, and they made it clean any assault on one colony would be taken into consideration an attack on all. In taverns and meeting homes across the continent, everyday humans started the use of phrases that had once been whispered best in personal: solidarity, resistance, liberty. In bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had imagined it would overwhelm revolt. Alternatively, it had welded the colonies collectively into something a long way extra dangerous: a people who, no matter their differences, were starting to consider themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution had been no longer just stirring. They were accumulating right into a storm. And it turned into too overdue for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates that were destroyed. It became the illusion that the Yank colonies could stay unswerving subjects forever. The Boston Tea birthday party lit a spark that no king, no navy, no distant parliament may want to ever snuff out. Within the months that accompanied, that spark caught fire across the colonies. What had once been protests, boycotts, and well-mannered petitions hardened into open resistance. Town militias started out drilling openly, storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who had once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution under the identical roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. The extra Britain attempted to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped via its arms. Each deliver that sailed past the closed, silent harbor of Boston was a silent reminder that tyranny had met its suit in American defiance. While Parliament passed the intolerable acts, they meant to make an example out of Boston to scare the alternative colonies into submission. As an alternative, they'd created a martyr metropolis, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists found out that their fates had been tied together. Resistance became not approximately T. It became about survival, identity, freedom. By using the spring of 1775, the tension reached a boiling point out of doors Boston. Inside the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to confiscate colonial weapons as a substitute found armed farmers, everyday guys geared up to protect their rights with musket hearth. The first pictures of the Yankee Revolution rang out, an instantaneous line traced back to the instant when men selected precept over income and dumped a fortune's well worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Birthday Party confirmed the sector that revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and banners. Every so often it starts quietly with a small institution of determined people's status inside the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax. They had been rejecting an empire. And although the road ahead could be bloody, sour, and unsure, one thing had grown to be clear that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies had been not unswerving topics. They had been something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they had been just getting commenced. All before the towering pyramids of Giza, earlier than Mesopotamian towns buzzed with life, earlier than Stonehenge stood against the sky, there was Carol. Hidden away in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, Carol rose in silent majesty almost 5,000 years in the past, then dwindled into close to complete oblivion, swallowed by sands and forgotten with the aid of records. For centuries, the sector did no longer even know it existed. The Soup Valley, wherein Carol once thrived, seems in the beginning glance an unlikely vicinity for civilization to bloom. The panorama is parched, barren, the river little more than a thin silver thread winding through rocks and dirt. To most eyes it seemed inhospitable, an area abandoned by life. But it turned into right here, amid the desolation, that one in all humanity's earliest exquisite cities took shape. Carol wasn't just a collection of scattered huts or a brief trading publish. It was a planned city sprawling over 150 acres, filled with pyramids, plazas, residential quarters, and ceremonial areas. It had scale, purpose, and imaginative and prescient. A complex society blossoming centuries earlier than the Egyptians began stacking stones into pyramids in their very own. The human beings of Carol done this without the wheel, without written language, without steel equipment. They constructed massive systems from stone and earth, with nothing however ingenuity, communal attempt, and the uncooked electricity of human will. Yet for lots of years, Carol's life remained a mystery. Even when travelers stumbled across the atypical weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural formations, mere hills sculpted by the barren region winds. No one imagined that under the sand lay one of the oldest towns in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had crowned because the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists led by way of Ruth Shady exposed the reality. What they determined buried inside the dirt of time could rewrite the tale of the Americas and pressure the arena to reconsider what it thought it knew about the start of civilization itself. Carol had risen, flourished, and fallen in total anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speak me once more, whispering of a non-violent, wise folks who built a global of complexity and wonder in a land wherein lifestyles itself seemed impossible. And this became only the beginning of their tale. Before everything the Soup Valley looks as if an area where existence ought to battle to exist. Harsh winds sweep throughout infinite stretches of sand and stone. The sun beats down mercilessly, drying out the earth, baking the landscape into cracked, brittle sheets. Water is scarce, the river a meandering thread, combating for survival. To the untrained eye, it's far a wasteland, barren, empty, forgotten by using the gods. But the people of Carroll noticed something one of a kind. They did no longer see a barren region to be feared. They saw a canvas to be fashioned. They recognized the river, however modest, as the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and sheer determination, they grew to become this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of lifestyles and subculture. Their first victory changed into agriculture. They found out to tame the river's seasonal floods, constructing simple but fantastic irrigation structures that channeled water across the valley floor. In which others saw sand and dust, they coaxed green shoots of wish, cotton, beans, squash, guava, candy potatoes. Cotton especially became their treasure. It changed into spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling change with coastal villages and creating bonds that stretched a long way past their wasteland home. But developing plants became most effective part of their mastery. The humans of Carroll understood that survival in the desert required balance. They labored with nature, not against it. They built their houses and plazas from stone and earth, designed to face up to each scorching warmth and the rare, punishing rains that occasionally swept through the valley. They studied the stars and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of grasp astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Carroll's financial system. Dried fish, cotton, culmination, and home-made items flowed up and down the coast. In change, Carroll obtained individual items, colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, ideas from remote peoples. They had been not remoted. They had been connected. In a land where survival seemed not possible, Carroll thrived through intelligence, innovation, and community. They didn't conquer the desolate tract with brute force. They partnered with it, getting to know its rhythms, respecting its energy, building a society that turned into now not just functional. It was superb. Against the chances, Carroll blossomed right into a beacon of civilization, and it became only beginning to rise. Rising out of the wasteland like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Carroll defy everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. Those had been now not small, crude structures built by way of primitive fingers. They were massive, planned works of architecture created with the aid of a people with vision, employer, and ambition. The centerpiece of the metropolis turned into the Pyramid Mayor, the largest of Carroll's huge systems. It stretched extra than 450 ft in duration and towered nearly 60 feet above the barren region ground, a feat of engineering on par with the early wonders of the historical global. Built from stone, dust, and woven reed baggage packed with rocks, known as asterisk shikra, the pyramid turned into design no longer simply to endure the cruel weather, however to resist the punishing earthquakes that on occasion rattled the place. And bear it did, status silent towards wind and time for almost 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Carroll were no longer tombs. Unlike the big burial complexes of Egypt, Carroll's pyramids served a special purpose. They have been centers of rite, electricity, and public life. Temples and amassing areas topped their summits, accessible by broad, fashionable staircases. Fires as soon as burned atop those platforms, and rituals had been held underneath the endless Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, sizable plazas spread out, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to gather for religious ceremonies, political conferences, and communal celebrations. The very format of Carroll's cityscape cautioned a society that prized community and order, a human beings deeply connected to each other and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes fanned out, likely home to monks, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seemed to have been strategically positioned, aligned with celestial occasions, sunrises, solstices, the cycles of the stars. To the people of Carroll, structure wasn't simply sensible. It becomes spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Walking among the weathered stones these days, it's almost impossible no longer to feel an ordinary experience of awe. These structures have been raised without metal gear, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet they rose with symmetry, scale, and stunning precision. The super pyramids of Carroll were now not constructed for arrogance, nor for battle. They had been constructed to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity. And that they nevertheless whisper across the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the ruins of Carroll, there is something profoundly unique, something that sets it other than so many ancient civilizations. No guns had been discovered buried underneath its sands. No protecting partitions circle its plazas. No mass graves trace at bloody conquest or internal strife. In contrast to the kingdoms that rose and fell through struggle, Carroll turned into a society built on peace. It's a revelation that defies expectancies. Right here was a civilization that flourished no longer through violence, however through cooperation, change, and shared belief. The humans of Carroll seem to have invested their energy now not in armies or fortresses, however in structure, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids weren't monuments to victory over enemies. They had been centers of party, worship, and governance. This was a civilization that chose to gather in place of conquer, to negotiate in preference to destroy. Trade turned into the lifeblood of Carroll's fulfillment. Cotton grown along the fertile river banks became spun into fishing nets that were traded with coastal communities. In return, Carroll obtained dried fish, an crucial source of protein, and different items from some distance away places. Colorful shells from the Pacific, treasured stones from the highlands, or even uncommon tropical fruits from remote valleys. This wide community of alternates stitched the area together, binding along way-flung groups into a non-violent web of mutual advantage. And inside the middle of it all, Carroll thrived as a cultural and financial hub. Religious and ceremonial lifestyles played a crucial function in preserving social harmony. The metropolis's grand public spaces and sunken plazas probably served as stages for rituals that united the human beings below shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled those gatherings. Flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, developing soundscapes that echoed across the barren region, tying individual lives to something more. Leadership, too, appeared to depend less on military energy and greater on religious authority and civic organization. The town's leaders have to have coordinated large creation tasks, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complicated alternate agreements, all without leaving at the back of the brutal scars of struggle. In an historic international so frequently described by using battle, Carroll stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization does now not must rise on the damaged backs of the conquered. It may, as an alternative, be constructed by the quiet strength of collaboration, creativity, and agree with. At Carroll, the stones still seem to hum with echoes of a world lengthy long past. It changed into now, not just a town of houses and exchange. It turned into a town alive with sound, rite and spiritual rhythm. Song and formality were woven into the very heartbeat of Carroll's civilization. Archaeologists digging carefully through the dry sands recovered a treasure trove of historical gadgets: flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles original from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts have been now not easy toys. They were crafted with care, tuned to specific notes, designed to hold sound across the huge open plazas of the metropolis. In a global without written language, tracks spoke the language of the soul. Imagine it, the low thrum of drums growing at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping on the sunken plazas as lots amassed beneath the fatting mild. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid structures. Monks dressed in complicated woven garments might chant to the gods of the river, the earth, the stars. In those moments, Carroll became no longer just a metropolis. It turned into a symphony. The format of Carroll itself shows that ritual life turned into at its core. The grand plazas were not mere open spaces. They had been tiers for communal ceremonies, cautiously designed to draw human beings together. The sunken round courts acted like historical amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals performed at their facilities. And above them all, the pyramids loomed not as tombs, however, as sacred mountains built by human fingers, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals possibly marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the actions of the celebrities. Music was now not just entertainment. It turned into a bridge among human beings, between nature and the divine, among the recognized and the mysteries past. No violent murals, no terrifying gods of war, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Carroll, the non-secular global seems to were one in all harmony, party and reverence. Even these days, when the barren region wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost pay attention it. The faint traces of historical track, the forgotten songs of individuals who observed splendor, meaning and connection within the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Carroll wasn't simply a place of song, change, and formality. It was a surprise of engineering, a testimony to human ingenuity in one of the harshest landscapes in the world. Without steel equipment, without the wheel, without draft animals, the people of Carroll fashioned a town of stone and earth that has continued nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements had been outstanding. Massive pyramids rose from the desolate tract floor, built no longer with small, fragile bricks, but with substantial stones carried across the dry valley. People transported rocks the use of *shikra* bags, resourceful baskets sturdy enough to undergo heavy hundreds woven from the very flowers that grew alongside the river banks. Layer upon layer they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create systems that would resist no longer simplest time but nature's fury. And they understood nature well. Carroll lies in a location prone to violent earthquakes, but their pyramids and plazas survived in large part intact. How? through mastering earthquake-resistant structure. Builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, extensive foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to soak up and expend seismic strength. It turned into engineering born now not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was every other silent triumph. Notwithstanding residing in a barren region, the human beings of Carroll evolved sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, permitting crops to flourish even during dry seasons. No water became wasted. Every drop mattered. The layout of Carroll itself contemplated brilliant city planning. Main structures aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep know-how of the sun's cycles. The sunken plazas with their unique geometry weren't more than gathering locations. They had been devices for tracking the heavens, allowing monks and astronomers to are expecting seasons crucial for survival. Even the town's organization talked about a complicated society. Residential zones, administrative regions, ceremonial centers, all were organized in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred areas. They constructed not just for the instant but for generations. Nowadays, as modern-day engineers marvel at Carroll's resilience, they're reminded that greatness isn't measured through era alone. Sometimes the private know-how lies in expertise, the forces of nature, in running with the land, no longer towards it. Carroll's stones have endured storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their desires into the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Carroll flourished, a beacon of peace, trade, and architectural mastery in the desolate tract sands. And then, quietly, nearly without a trace, it changed into deserted. No fires marked its fall. No signs and symptoms of conquest scar its partitions. No mass graves or shattered monuments tell a story of unexpected catastrophe. Rather, Carroll in reality dwindled. Its plazas emptied. Its pyramids left to the drifting sands. Its flutes and drums silenced with the aid of time. Why did they go away? That query nonetheless lingers like a ghost across the Soup Valley. Some pupils trust that environmental change struck the final blow. Proof indicates that a protracted period of drought may additionally have crippled Carroll's agriculture. Without the river's existence-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks depending on surplus cotton and food would have faltered. The careful stability Carroll had maintained with its harsh surroundings can also have eventually tipped past repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of energy emerged alongside the coast and inland, Carroll's have an effect on might have diminished. Perhaps the products they as soon as supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were not enough to sustain their position as a dominant town. Slowly the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written information, we can only imagine political struggles, non-secular upheaval, or easy exhaustion after centuries of boom. Even peaceful societies can fracture beneath pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, now not unexpected. Families probably drifted away one at a time, looking for more fertile valleys, more potent rivers, new beginnings. Kids who as soon as ran across Carroll's plazas grew up telling memories of a lost city at the back of them, memories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what human beings had constructed. Winds carried exceptional sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried underneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, colorful civilization have become a field of silent, napping mounds. For almost 4,000 years, Carroll remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting. These days, as archaeologists cautiously discover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, really vanish? Possibly the truth is that even the best civilizations, no matter how clever or peaceful, are nevertheless fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, for all time prone to the unseen forces of exchange. For millennia, Carroll lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Soup Valley. Vacationers exceeded the unusual rounded hills that dotted the panorama, never suspecting that under their toes lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, those had been just natural formations, mounds formed by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally pay attention Carroll's voice once more. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a crew into the Soup Valley, pushed with the aid of interest and a developing sense that these hills may maintain secrets and techniques no one had yet exposed. What they found might rewrite the story of human civilization inside the Americas. Layer through painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Underneath it emerged partitions of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a city some distance older than everybody ought to have imagined. Radiocarbon relationship confirmed the implausible. Carroll became over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It changed into a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Earlier than Carroll, students believed that civilization within the Americas advanced a lot later, shadowed with the aid of the wonderful empires of the vintage world. Carroll changed the whole lot. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex city life, and social business enterprise independently long before the rise of the Incas or the Maya. Ruth Shady and her team observed no longer just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life, musical contraptions, fishing nets, textiles, asterisk quipu, ancient knot records, or even offerings made to the gods. Every artifact instructed a story of a folks who had built a society with imaginative and prescient intelligence and profound creativity. Carroll's rediscovery was extra than an academic triumph. It turned into a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the barren region for thousands of years now stood discovered beneath the open sky yet again. Its plazas kissed by means of the equal winds that had as soon as carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of youngsters. These days, Carroll is identified as a UNESCO International Historical Past website, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Carroll properly, but ultimately the stones persisted, looking forward to someone to concentrate, to peer, to don't forget. Carroll stands these days as a silent large, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper than we as soon as believed. Amongst its pyramids and plazas, the historic stones whisper a story that reshapes our know-how of humanity's adventure, a story no longer of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and desire. Lengthy earlier than the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, The humans of Carol had been building something top-notch. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the celebs without written facts. They created a thriving society rooted in alternate, tune, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In a technology frequently described by using warfare, Carol offers any other imaginative and prescient of what civilization can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence. That greatness isn't measured by using what number of armies march across a battlefield. However, through how a community comes together to build, to create, to dream. Carol's legacy reaches a long way beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges vintage assumptions that civilization had an unmarried cradle, that city life and vast architecture belonged first to the old world. Carol proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped through exclusive arms, but driven by using the identical everlasting desires to undergo, to have fun, to reach closer to the divine. Nowadays, walking among Carol's weathered ruins, you can almost listen it. The heartbeat of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining within the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their testimonies are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Carol teaches us that even if civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping beneath sands, ready to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. Within the great timeline of human records, Carol shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the cruelest deserts, even underneath the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a global that reaches for the celebrities.